Good morning. Okay, we're about ready to get started. Kathy Shaggy, or McGackey, sorry about that. This time. Of all people, I should know. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, Bill. Anyhow, she told me that Mary Laird is getting home from the hospital today, and that's Butler Hospital, but will need a ride. So if anyone can do that, get with Kathy and try to work that out. So Mary Laird will need a ride. Obviously, we're real short-handed today with so many folks out at Altoona for the Lads to Leaders. Just a lot of the young people are out there, and it's good to see them participating and really gaining a lot of good skills that will serve them well as they move forward in the kingdom. That's about all I have announcements-wise. Anything else? Tyler, would you lead us in a word of prayer this morning?
You got me. Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, so much for this beautiful day you blessed us with. Thank you, Lord, for allowing us another opportunity to come, to worship, to strengthen each other, to learn more about your word, Lord, and how we can apply it to our daily lives. Lord, we're so grateful for being able to live in a country where we've had the freedom to do that. Lord, we know that there are so many around the world who may not have that luxury, Lord. We just pray that you will continue to strengthen and encourage them. We pray for all those who may be traveling this weekend and keep them safe as they make their way home from their destination. Lord, help us to be able to put away the distractions of our lives today during this worship so that we can focus on your word and focus on each other. Lord, we just pray that you will bestow the knowledge of your word to those who are helping us learn today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay, Hebrews chapter 10. We started talking about this verse last week and got sidetracked a little bit, but verses 29 and 30 of Hebrews chapter 10. Of how much sorer punishment, think ye, shall he be judged worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant, wherewith he was sanctified, an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. For we know him that said, Vengeance belongeth to me, I will recompense. And again, the Lord shall judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So this is in the context the Hebrew writer was talking about what happened under the old law, to people that disobeyed. And if you think about it, one of the examples that I provided was, the man in Numbers chapter 15, verse 36, he was stoned to death for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Now that seems like that's pretty extreme, but the Hebrew writer is using those as examples to show that under the old law, there was a price tag for people that sinned and did things that they weren't supposed to. And he says, now, how much sorer punishment, or, you might say, how much of a worse punishment shall be judged worthy who hath trodden under foot the Son of God. And trodden under foot is from the very same Greek word used by Matthew for a heartless and totally indifferent action. If you think about it, rejecting God is actually, or rejecting Christ is actually an insult to God. That's, if you take the Greek words and actually look at it, it comes across as an insult to God. And I like how the New King James Version translates the part where it says sanctified and an unholy thing. The New King James Version calls it a common thing. To think that the blood of Christ was just common, they're indifferent to it. That's a very serious thing. And he's talking to the Hebrew Christians who were drifting back into the old law. And I think this is something that should be something that is concerning to all of us, because it's easy to say, "Oh, I'd never do that," and you might actually think it. But I have known people that I would never have guessed they would walk away from the church. Wouldn't have believed it. Couldn't have convinced me of it. And yet, they're not here. A few years ago, I was talking with a person in that situation, and they know. They absolutely know the situation they're in, and I could not get them to come back. And so it can happen to good people. And it's easy to say, well, they were never really converted in the first place. Except I don't believe that in some cases. I don't believe it. Because people that were here and worked a lot, put in a lot of time, just involved in so many different ways, and chose to walk away, and that becomes an insult to God. Now, granted, it's usually because of choices that were made, and because of it, they said, "Oh, what's the use?" type thing. But it is a big deal when we choose to knowingly, eyes wide open, walk away from God. Because he takes that as an insult to him that the blood of his son isn't good enough. That's basically how it comes across. In verse 30, it talks about Yes.
What is interesting about that is the disciple Judas. Judas.
Yeah.
I mean, he was picked by the Lord.
Yep.
He had to be a good worker, faithful at one time.
I believe that.
Yet he decided on his own to do what he did. And Christ even knew that was going to happen. But in some sense, I guess he hoped it wouldn't.
Yeah. I've struggled with that, Randy. That's a great point. I honestly think, this is just my take, I honestly think that when Judas was selected, that he was good. I think he was. And I think over time, he became the treasurer for the group. And when they would get some money, and people like Lazarus and ones that had means would often support them and give them money. And what ended up happening is that money became something that got a hold of them. And how could a person walk with Jesus for plus or minus 3 years, see all the miracles, see all the things that were done, listen to all the teaching, and then turn from them? It's hard to imagine that. But that should tell us all the more, that we have to be careful. Because if someone in Judas' situation can turn bad, you and I can turn bad. The Apostle Paul, other than Christ himself, you could make an argument that no one has done more to further the church than the Apostle Paul did. And what did he say? He said he had to buffet his body daily, lest after he had preached to others, he would become a castaway. The Apostle Paul was worried about being a castaway. I better worry about it too. And he said he buffeted his body daily. I find that an interesting way of putting it. In other words, he, worked hard at bringing himself under subjection to keep himself in the faith and straight and narrow, trying to do things. In other words, he worked at his Christian walk to make sure he didn't fall away. It can happen. I've seen good people do it. Any thought or comment on that? Okay. And in verse 30, he says, vengeance belongeth to me. I will recompense, or I will repay. The Lord shall judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And these quotations are roughly, the Hebrew writer takes a little bit of liberty and doesn't quote them exactly, but they're taken from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 35 and 36. And the Lord shall judge his people is a warning to all of us. It's a warning of judgment for the saints themselves. And Peter even noticed this when he said in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 18, and if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Milligan noted the following. He said, there's a difference in falling into the hands of God for correction and in falling into his hands for judgment. God sometimes corrects us. He brings things upon us to make us see things, and the Bible tells us that sometimes God lets things happen and ultimately it becomes for our own good. James says that sometimes we're tried, and the trying of our faith worketh patience. And sometimes it is hard to be patient through tough times. Arlene, I think of Lori and what they went through. And Arlene was telling me today that something that just made me smile. Rick and Lori, they love to go camping. And they had a camper, and they go, and wherever they go, they still go to church and everything, but they go camping. And then she got this condition and couldn't. For the first time in 5 years, they went. I think that's pretty awesome. So, Arlene, thanks for sharing that with me. I appreciate that. Roberta, you had a thought.
We're tested and tried all the time. Well, I don't need that. Do I?
Mine do.
We are tested and tried all the time. If God's going to test us and see if we're going to be faithful or if we're going to go the other way.
That's true.
And it's just, it's a daily thing for me. I think I'm okay. Then I think, no, I don't want to do this. I want to do that.
I understand.
You got to be strong. You have to be strong for God.
Yeah, it actually is. I appreciate the way you put that. I think all of us, if we're honest, and especially if we're working at it, would have to admit that sometimes we feel the tension in ourselves between the world and Christ. Like there's a part of us, I'd like to do this. And then the thought comes into your mind, yeah, but that isn't the right thing to do. And people, I think, should feel that tension. If we don't feel the temptation and the fight against it, then maybe we're given into easily. I think we should feel every once in a while that tension in us, the fight that we're, undergoing. Because sometimes I think, oh, I think I'll do this, and then I'll think, no, that isn't the right thing to do. And you have to fight it off. So I appreciate that. I understand exactly. For we're all tempted. The Bible tells us that all people are tempted. It's just whether or not you will persevere against that temptation. So I appreciate that. Any other thought or comment? Yeah, Jackie. Here comes Bill. He's on his way.
Thank you. It's funny because just this morning that happened at our house because, I've been married to Randy for 32 years. And I don't try to make him go to church, but he had something else that he really kind of needed to do this morning. And he actually felt bad for not coming to church. So I feel like I've accomplished something. And God has too. I told him, I said, God would be proud of you for feeling that way. Maybe not the fact that you didn't come, but at least he was feeling it, that he should be here.
Well, that's a perfect example of what I was trying to portray. If you think about it, I can remember a lot of times, this is back when I was working. It's not so bad now, I appreciate that. But back when I was working, Wednesday nights were sometimes tough. Cold Wednesday nights in the winter after you'd worked all day, especially if you had to stay over a little bit, then come home and you're already tired. And there's Satan's at you. You're beat. Nobody's going to miss you. And I remember those battles. I had them. I won most of them, but was there a time or two that I didn't? Yeah. And I think we can all appreciate that. Right there's one of the better examples of temptation, is. And influence. Yeah. And I think in Dan's case, you work a night shift, right, a lot? You're probably here without any sleep, right? 2 hours. You feel it sometimes, don't you? Of course you do. That's just being human, So we have to keep all those things in mind. Anything else before we move on? Yeah, Bill.
For years and years, I prayed for my girls to come to church. Finally, one of them showed up here a couple months ago, and I got one down and one to go. And it was such a surprise when she called me the night before and said, I'm going to be in church tomorrow. Don't make a big deal about it. I said, I won't even let on you're here. But persistence pays off. You pray long enough, your prayers will be answered.
There's another good example there of where temptation can hit. You pray and it don't seem to be working. Do you stop praying? What's the use? Have you ever felt that way? Sometimes it's easy to think, I don't know why God's not listening, And I think again about Rick and Lori, 5 years, And I think, they never told me this, but I have to believe that sometimes doubts came in. Have to believe it, And it would be totally understanding. I would understand it completely. But they never gave up. And I think the old analogy I've said before, I think really works in this case. A number of years ago, I was a young guy. I'm not into boxing anymore. But when I was a young guy, I liked to watch it. This one guy was just getting beat to a pulp. I mean, they'd stop the fight and put that junk on their face, to stop bleeding and everything. He looked a mess. He kept answering the bell. And then he threw a haymaker and knocked the guy out, and ended up winning the match. Even though he was outclassed, he was. The other guy was a better, and he threw a lucky punch and got him. It wasn't that so much that won him the fight, though. He just kept answering the bell. So even when you don't feel like you're being successful, even when you don't feel exactly like you're 100%, keep answering the bell. Because you're not always going to have what I call your A game, where you're just feeling so spiritual and everything. There's going to be times when you have to push on with your C game, and just tough it through and keep answering the bell. Verse 32, it says, "But call to remembrance the former days in which after you were enlightened, ye endured a great conflict of suffering, partly being made a gazing stock both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly becoming partakers with them that were so used." So here the Hebrew writer is asking them to think back from when they were first converted. And some of these may have even been some that heard Peter's first sermon. In the early days, the Jewish Christians were persecuted. Remember when they had to scatter? They had to leave because they were under such pressure, from the Jewish leaders and others, and they had to leave. And they hung in there through all those rough times. Families were torn apart and everything else. And they did what was right. And he's saying, did you really go through all of that only to fall back now? That's the idea here. Remember how you were strong and you endured, a great conflict of suffering. You did it before, you can do it again. And you were like a gazing stock. He meant like a laughing stock is what we might call it in our language. That people were making fun of them. Why did you go after this? The rest of your family are still Jewish. Why would you do this? That kind of thing. And they were picked on and ridiculed. And they went through all of that. But now they're starting to become weak and starting to falter a little bit. And the Hebrew writer is calling them, saying, don't do that. I had a conversation, not that long ago with someone who was older. And I said, and they admitted to having some trouble and feeling weak and stuff like that. I said, you're in the home stretch now. You can see the finish line. Now is not the time to give up. And I say that to all the folks who are my age or beyond. The finish line's in sight. You've done it for your whole life. Don't fall away now. And I've seen a couple examples in my life of people who have been Christians most of their whole life, and toward the end, let it drift away. That seems to me to be crazy, And I would encourage everyone not to lose heart. Any other thought or comment? Okay. Verse 34. For ye both had compassion on them that were in bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your possessions, knowing that ye have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. I find it interesting here where it says you had compassion on them that were in bonds. If you look at the Greek, it's more compassion on me in my bonds is what it really says. Boy, that's the best argument, in my opinion, for Paul being the author. I don't know who it was. You know, it might not have been Paul, it might have been, I don't know. But this is the best argument because the same words that he uses about his bonds and other places is used here. Take what you will from that. You know, I don't know. In verse 35 it says, "Cast not away therefore your boldness, which hath great recompense of reward." So we need to stay bold. We need to stay strong in the face of temptation, in the face of the pressures of this world, because the world knows how to attack you, don't it? It does. And we just have to remember the reward that awaits. Sometimes I'll find myself thinking on, you know, what heaven might be like. You know, there's a song that we used to sing. It talks about that, you know, thinking about, you know, sometimes we dream together of how it will be. I forget exactly God's family. I can't remember the exact title, but sometimes I find myself thinking about what heaven would be like, and I don't know. It's going to be great. You know, if it was me, Carl, it'd be a fishing stream that went on for miles with lots of fish. But I don't know what it'll be like. But it's going to be wonderful, I know that, because sin won't be there and God will be. That's enough right there for me. In verse 36, it talks about, "For ye have need of patience, that having done the will of God, ye may receive the promise." And this begins the fourth great exhortation of the book of Hebrews. You know, the idea of being steadfast and patient. And sometimes we have to wait for a while. And sometimes we have to fight through adversities for a long time. And I think about Job. You know, the things that happened to Job, I don't know how well I'd have done with that. You know, I really don't. But he had patience and he kept going, and he talked about looking for God. He talked about looking to the north, couldn't find him there, to the west, the south, and east, could find him nowhere. And he talked about how he wished he could present his case before God. You know, and it seemed like God was gone, is the way it seemed like for Job, that he didn't know where he went, and he wanted to argue his case before him. You know, and I think sometimes for us, we can wonder where God is when we're going through trials, but he's there. And this idea of having patience and waiting, you know, he does things on his time. Sometimes that don't really coincide with our time very well. And some of us are not a very patient people. I definitely struggle with that. It's maybe the worst thing I got. You know, I'll be there if a commercial's on them. I'm going every. Carl, I won't say it. You do the same thing?
Well, he mostly has a changer, but.
She'd make a terrible turkey hunter.
I got it.
The microwave's not fast enough for me.
But, you know, it's hard to be patient, isn't it? It's hard because we want things right away. And it's something that we have to learn it, right? Who's some of the very most impatient people that are around? Newborns, right? If they want fed right now, or else they're throwing a fit, you know? And it's an acquired thing. And some of us acquire it faster than others, you know? And we need to be patient and just wait for God to do his will. Oh, Steve, I'm sorry.
Maybe this is a little off, and I don't know exactly who this was written to. It was written to Hebrews,
Yeah.
but it might have been written to those in Jerusalem and such like. And I wonder, and I don't know this, but I wonder if some of these people hadn't fallen into the political situation that was going on in Jerusalem, and among the Jews, for centuries really, the Jews wanted their freedom, and particularly from Rome. And there was a lot of zealots at this point wanting to overthrow Rome. And the political situation was such that I just wonder if some of these Hebrew Christians didn't fall into the political situation that was going on at the time, and maybe this kind of led them back to their Jewish roots rather than their Christian roots. You know, they were, you know, Titus came in 70 AD and destroyed Rome because of the uprisings that were going on, the political situation, the wanting to get rid of Rome. And maybe these Jewish Christians fell into their nationalistic thinking, and maybe this was leading them back to practicing their Judaism rather than their Christianity. I don't know that this is the case, but I just kind of wonder whether that situation wasn't leading people back to their Jewish roots rather than their Christian roots.
I find that actually likely. I had never thought of that. But what Steve is basically saying, see, Jerusalem and Israel was attacked by Rome because there were starting to be more and more revolts. Attacked by Rome, actually it was a little bit before AD 70, but it finally fell in AD 70, you know. And even the Hebrew Christians would not have liked Rome. They would have, and the national pride, it'd be like, you know, I'm trying to think of a good core. If this country was attacked, remember how you felt on 9/11 and everything? Well, what was happening, and Steve, I think your point's really good, I never thought of it, is the Roman armies were coming to take Jerusalem. And they remembered back to their old days, and they were ready to fight for Israel against the Romans. And that sense of nationalism may have also went into their religious activities, drifting back to the law. I think that's a great point. I think it's likely, actually. Yeah, I'm like you, I don't know for sure, but it makes sense. It makes sense. And so there was that going on too. And Hebrews was written in the 60s AD, so that works. That idea, I think, works. In verse 37, it says, "For yet a very little while he that cometh shall come and shall not tarry." So God is going to come. And this is a partial quotation from Habakkuk 2 and verse 3, where it says, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry. Wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. And sometimes I think that's a tough thing, because, God will come. It's been 2,000 years, and some people think, well, yeah, right, he's not coming. But the Bible texts tell us he's going to come as a thief in the night, when people least expect it. He's going to come, and there are a lot of surprised people. I think back to Noah. He was building the ark, and it took quite a bit of time for that to be accomplished. And I'm sure people were coming by, ain't seen much rain lately, Noah, and I'm sure he was taking a bunch of criticism for that. But boy, when the waters come, I'm sure they were clawing, trying to get it at the boat and everything, you know what I mean? And it'll be like that. We don't know when it's going to finally come, but when it does, there's going to be a lot of shocked people, and people that were sometimes made fun of are going to look pretty smart on that day. So, thought or comment? Yeah, Linda.
How would they know, because they didn't know what rain was?
Linda, I believe that's the case. So Linda's point,
There's a verse in the Bible that says it was a mist that went up in Genesis.
yeah,
So there would have been a mist, so all they would know was the mist. It would have been no rain, so they wouldn't know what the word rain meant.
that's correct.
Yeah.
What Linda's talking about is there's a pretty strong case that can be made that rainfall, like we know it, may not have existed before. And whether there was like volcanoes that caused dust to go in the air and everything like that. But I've heard that argument that, he talked about the earth being flooded, and they probably thought, how? How would that be accomplished? But yeah, I have heard that. And I think there's some good things to be said about that.
Well, really, it almost has to be true when he said the mist went up, and then that was the first time it rained. It almost has to be 100% correct if the Bible says it, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
There would be no controversy, no arguments over it.
I don't think so. I've heard people try to, but I don't think so. I think the Bible said that's how it said that the earth was watered from the mist that rose up. So I think you could make an argument for that. Verse 38, but my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrink back, my soul hath no pleasure in him. But we are not of them that shrink back into perdition, but of them that have faith unto the saving of the soul. And so the argument here is, by the Hebrew writer, is the righteous one shall live by faith. You don't always see it, and you have to have patience and wait for it, but you have to live by faith. And if you back away from the faith, if you shrink back, then, it says, my soul hath no pleasure in him. So if we choose to shrink back, then we've made a choice. And when we shrink back, as it calls, or fall back away, then we've walked away from God. And it says he will have no pleasure in us. That's not a good place to be. But then the Hebrew writer tries to encourage them, but that's not us. We're not going to be that way. And I would say the same thing to you today. Yes, there are people that have fallen away, people that have been here for a long time know some that have. That doesn't have to be you. Just because you can fall away doesn't mean you will fall away. It's possible, but it doesn't mean that it will occur. And let's just make sure that in each of our cases, that won't be the way it is. We won't fall back. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you.